Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the 2024 Boardroom webinar series by the Institute of Directors in India, where innovation meets tradition, ideas converge, and strategies evolve. I'm Jennifer Jukanovich. I will be your co-host for today. It's my honor to bring you greetings from Boston, Massachusetts, which is where I live, and so it's a tremendous honor to learn and join with you in this conversation today. This Boardroom webinar series is supported by several amazing organizations without whom this conversation would not take place. And so we want to thank our strategic partner, NASDAQ, our institutional partners, BitScore Cybertech LLP, BoardPack, and Gujarat Fluorochemicals Limited. Our knowledge partners today are Helix Consulting and Tachman. The theme of today's webinar is the Green Agenda, ESG and Net Zero Imperatives for Boardrooms. We all know with climate change posing an ever greater threat and global awareness of ESG issues continuing to rise, that corporate boards are under increasing pressure to incorporate sustainability into their strategic decision-making processes. And so in this context, today's session will explore the critical role that boards play in driving sustainability initiatives, setting ambitious net zero targets, as well as leading the conversation on practical tools and resources that can effectively manage environmental risks and capitalize on green opportunities. We are so delighted to have such a distinguished lineup of speakers and experts who are going to share their insights and experiences with us today. They will be sharing their perspectives, their strategies, their success stories, and we look forward to learning from them. At the end of our session, I will also have the privilege of sharing a few key insights from a book that I recently co-authored called The Culturally Conscious Board, Setting the Boardroom Table for Impact, and I look forward to sharing that with you. So without further ado, let's begin our journey into the green agenda and explore how boards can seize green opportunities for sustainable growth. So I'm just going to give you a few instructions. If you are joining from your phone, would you please tilt that to landscape or horizontal? That'll just make for a better viewing experience. And also please note that the chat box will be enabled during the Q&A session. So feel free to join in at that time. To commence today's address, I would like to introduce Professor Colin Coulson-Thomas, the Director General of UK and Europe Operations for the Institute of Directors India in London, and he will be providing our opening address. Dr. Coulson-Thomas.
Thank you, Jennifer. On behalf of IOD, welcome to this webinar on ESG and net zero imperatives. IOD champions responsible corporate leadership. We advocate sustainable and inclusive outcomes and growth. And we're also ready to confront realities. The future of humanity cannot be assumed. In a fracturing world, we face global risks and multiple existential threats. Most of them, including global warming, result from human activity. Overall population growth, business activities, and lifestyles are unsustainable. Corporate and individual responses are often too little, too late. Global emissions and average temperatures continue to rise. If remaining tipping points are triggered, global warming becomes unstoppable. Many damaging externalities, negative impacts, and unintended consequences are ignored. Self and vested interests often favor the status quo. From now on, further progress may become more difficult. The low-hanging fruit has already been harvested. Responsible directors and boards face many obstacles. They include distractions, misinformation, disinformation, and delaying tactics and strategies. The cost of disruption costs and disruption of phasing out fossil fuels may be opposed. Action that could put a company at a competitive disadvantage might be avoided. However, the costs of inaction are likely to rise faster than the cost of transition. Moving forward, Indian directors have a critical role to play. Projections suggest that India will account for an ever greater share of global emissions. Faster progress to net zero could tip the balance in favour of our collective survival. Increasingly, cooperation, collaboration, and collective responses are required. Boards can engage with stakeholders and appeal to a shared interest in survival. They can enable alternatives and advocate living in harmony with the natural world. With all these challenges come unprecedented opportunities to do things differently and be more resilient. More boards could focus on responsible outcomes and inspire entrepreneurship. We can innovate, reinvent, renew, and relocate communities and infrastructures. We can create employment and enable simpler, healthier, and more sustainable lifestyles. Imposed requirements and general provisions can be crude instruments. Some of them may hinder rather than help. Excessive requirements could be simplified and onerous burdens reduced. Boards may better judge what is best for local situations, circumstances, and contexts. Directors face dilemmas, tough choices, and difficult trade-offs. Is your company a leader or a laggard in ambition, action, and outcomes? Is it seeking to do more or the bare minimum? What are other companies doing in India and elsewhere? IOD exists to help and support you. IOD colleagues have assembled a stellar lineup of authoritative speakers. You have opportunities to listen, learn, and question. Seize them and really enjoy today's session.
Thank you, Professor Thomas, for setting the reality of our situation and exhorting us with that challenge and that just warm welcome. We are grateful. It is now my privilege to introduce our esteemed guest of honor, Mr. V.S. Sundaresan, Executive Director at Securities and Exchange Board of India. Mr. Sundaresan has over 30 years of experience in the securities market and currently heads the SEBI's Market Regulation and Information Technology departments. He oversees policymaking, administration, and supervision of stock exchanges, clearing corporations, and depositories, along with SEBI's cybersecurity and IT infrastructure. Mr. Sundaresan will share his insights on the theme BRSR Reporting, a guide to the boardroom community. Please welcome Mr. V.S. Sundaresan. Over to you, sir.
Good evening to all of you. Am I audible and is the screen sharing is visible?
Yes, sir, you're audible and the screen is also visible.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I thank IOD for inviting me to share my thoughts on this subject. So when this topic and the request was received, I just did a Google search on regarding finance, which are the words which are more popular. What I found was the first word which was coming was inflation. The second was taxation. And the third was on ESG. So today, that means even in the financial sector, the word ESG is quite popular. And I think people are quite interested to know what type of developments are taking place and what type of improvements being brought in this ESG concept by the corporates. And that has become very important for one and all. So first, let me tell you that the global initiatives which have been taken in the field of ESG over a period of time is, as far as the reporting is concerned, the global reporting initiative came back almost 2 decades back. Then this Sustainability Accounting Standards Board came up with their own standards and regarding the reporting standards for climate change and other related issues. Then there was a specific task force on climate-related financial disclosures, because the people were, when we follow the practice of comply or explain, and we people all like to, instead of complying, they simply explain. So over a period of time, these disclosure standards have been strengthened by the various international forums, and then more particularly, this carbon disclosure project was brought into place. And of course, we all know about the UN Global Compact. Important aspect came into being, and the last one being this, international integrated reporting, because there was always a disconnect between the sustainability reporting and the financial reporting, and there was a need to bring them together so that whatever is presented to the shareholders or the stakeholders at large by the corporates or uniform and also presented in a cogent form. So this International Integrated Reporting Council came out with a much broader way of reporting standards, which is being followed by many jurisdictions now. Having said that, coming to today's situation, where when we talk about one hand ease of doing business, another hand ethical financing, and at the same time ESG, there is always a sort of a clash between all of them, because if you want to do ease of doing business, complying with the ESG norms is very difficult. And if you want to comply with ESG, then the people complying that ease of doing business is difficult. So, we are in the crossroads. On one hand, every corporate, as a regulator, everywhere the demand is that we should do ease of doing business. But when at the same time, when you talk about ease of doing business, only from the business perspective, whether it should be ease of doing business or from the overall perspective. If you take the overall perspective into the account, then ESG comes into play. So there is always a pull and push on this compliance with these ESG standards, and we are always in the crossroads. With this, what type of initiatives as an Indian, whether it is the government of India, whether it is the regulator, whoever is there, we have been taking a lot of initiative in ensuring that ESG standards are increased over a period of time and brought to the global standards, starting from almost 2 decades back. Listing agreement containing a clause pertaining to sustainability and governance standards. Then we brought in 2010 for public enterprises. First, the government said that let the public enterprises comply with these requirements and then make it applicable to the private enterprises. And then in 2012, the regulator made it for all the listed companies a concept called BRR, which is now in the form of BSSR, which is being going to be discussed today more in detail. Then, of course, SEBI came out with the concept of green bonds, and then the BRR was converted into BRSR. Initially, it was for voluntary, and of course, we all know, as I said, when you say comply or explain, people will prefer to, not to comply, but we need to bring some sort of a discipline. So it has been made voluntary, and slowly we are making it into mandatory by giving a glide path. And as I said, now for the top 100 companies it was made, and I think now it is slowly increased to 1,000 companies over a period of time. So this type of initiative has been taken. But then when these type of initiatives are being taken to strengthen the ESG standards, what happens is that because of this global crisis, there is always a problem that, whether even in many international jurisdictions, although whatever they claim to be complying with, slowly trying to, deter away because of the various compulsions. At one point of time, everybody said that liberalization is the norm. But today, everybody wants to protect their territory. Everybody wants to protect their boundaries because of these geopolitical tensions. And therefore, to some extent, the ESG, which is expected to reach the very higher level, according to me, in my personal opinion, has not moved beyond a point. And everybody is trying to, try to show that they are doing something which is extraordinary. But because of the compulsions of these geopolitical tensions, they, in order to protect their own territories and boundaries, instead of going out and then demonstrating the actual happening in the ESG, people are trying to do, which is quite popularly known as greenwashing. So we need to find a balance between reaching a higher standard and at the same time avoid the what you call allegation of greenwashing. So what are the challenges in that? So as I said, everybody is in a fast forward move today, whether it is in food sector, whether it is in any other sector. So when there is a project to be built, so that the first impression is whether to sort out the details first or build the project first. But in today's situation, it is the other way. People want first to build the project and sort out the details. And that is how ESG is also going towards, although it has been started with a very noble idea of bringing out a lot of changes to the climate and sustainability and governance. But what is actually happening today, if you see some of the reports which are available in public domain, they are more of optically compliance rather than the actual compliance. So therefore, there is a scope for improving the standards of reporting and how the boards can contribute to the benefit of to the betterment of reporting. We will discuss now. So basically, what is this BRSR, which is prescribed by SEBI, which basically contains what? And then we will go as to how to ensure better compliance and disclosure with that. First of all, it talks about the climate plus approach. We are very clear that the Indian economy and the Indian environmental situation is quite different from the global situation. Therefore, there is no point in simply copying what is being followed in the global standards and merely pasting it here. Therefore, we have followed a comparative approach as what is good for the emerging economy, which is India is emerging economy as compared to certain developed economies. So we have brought accordingly the social fabric available in this country and taking into account this climate plus approach we have put in place. Secondly, we have provided quantifiable metrics basically on two types of factors. One is on essential factors and the leadership factors. We have also given what type of indicators to be covered for essential indicators and what type of factors to be covered for leadership indicators. Similarly, we also know that many corporates in India also operating overseas, and there are certain jurisdictions where they may be making certain disclosures on ESG. So we have also provided the concept of interoperability of reporting. So whatever is internationally reported, and if the same requirements are to be compared here, one can do a cross reference to that rather than reproducing it, and then it will be a duplication of work. So consciously we have provided for this interoperability of reporting. And as I said at the beginning, we have made it mandatory for top 1,000 listed companies of a market cap in 23-24, and then slowly it will be increased over a period of time. And the good news is that there are companies, almost 200 companies, which are not covered in this or voluntarily complying with that. That shows a good trend, and it is actually a very good indicator that the people want to be more compliant than what the regulator is mandating. Of course, the details which are talked about in the BRSR includes the general disclosures about governance and sustainability, and what are the policies which is being put in place and how they are complied with, governance and oversight. And of course, the risk and opportunities, because risk is always there. The important aspect is what are the policies and steps in place to mitigate the risk is more important. And of course, what is the commitment? What is the extent of target along with the timelines by which the targets are expected to be achieved? So these are all the requirements which is need to be complied from the BRSR. Now, how do the board approach in ensuring compliance with that? What are the basic principles which the board will be expected to do is coming out like this. Now, the very important aspect is that first of all, the vision and strategy of the important thing has to be spelled out very clearly at the beginning itself. Because if you are not knowing what is expected from the board, then it will not be possible for what is to be complied with. So what is expected from the board is that, first of all, the important is to set up the vision and strategy, how this is need to be complied with. And second, whether the policies which are being complied with are properly approved at the competent level, and whether the policies are clear for the people who are expected to comply with that. And a very important aspect is what is the frequency by which it will be reviewed, because it is an ongoing process. It is not that once you make a template and we will continue to follow that, because every day the things are changing, every day new aspects are coming into being. Therefore, there has to be a constant and frequent review of this performance related disclosure, so that at every point of time the disclosure made is actually updated one. Now, moving on to the principles which are expected to be followed by the board while ensuring that the disclosure is made appropriately. See, regulation is not the ceiling of responsibility. It is basically a sort of an indicator, or at best one can say that this is only a compass which will indicate and as a guiding principle. Merely a tick box approach will not serve the purpose, because it is not possible to envisage all the parameters or something which is applicable for the entire system. So if you are in a particular industry, the regulations may indicate what are the basic requirements, whereas the board is expected to see anything more needs to be done, and mere tick box approach based on the requirements given in the regulation will not be sufficient. The second one is, while making the disclosure, very important point to be kept in mind is the intent behind making the disclosure. The purpose is to ensure that mere making profit is not the objective, but also that we all know the 3 P's of ESG, basically the people, planet, and the purpose, and how we are actually doing things which are meeting the purpose to preserve this people, planet, and is purpose. These are very important to be disclosed, merely not just what is given in the regulation, whether it is complied or not. The third aspect from the board's perspective, my view is that it is not only to oversee what the management has given to the board. I will expect the board to have foresee. The board is expected to have some sort of a vision to anticipate what type of, what you call future responsibilities, and see from today's angle what is expected. Are we moving towards that direction, whether we are simply doing what is expected today, or what could be the expected in the next few years, whether a strategy has been given to the management while drafting this disclosure format. The next aspect is that how best we can align the governance and the sustainability standards, because what we try to achieve is to demonstrate an ethical leadership and enduring value over a period of time. So the purpose of ESG is not only to merge with the financial indicators, but it is to show the ethical aspects of the enterprise functioning and what type of value it is creating over a period of time in the society, rather than merely by how much of money they make over a period of time. The next important aspect for the board is, as I said, just not to comply, but to have in that particular industry, whether they are setting the benchmark for transparency and integrity, rather than simply following the standards. Because in each industry there will be a requirement slightly different from what has been set in the regulatory framework. The board is expected to slightly set the benchmark higher than the standard ones. And of course, we all know the standard, statement that precaution is the wisdom of foresight. So the board has to be vigilant, not simply go by the tall claims made by the management, whether it is a checked assumption or an unchecked assumption, or the claims made is simply, it may look sound, but whether it is being backed by data, whether it is backed by proper evidence, that is need to be ensured before the disclosure is approved. The next aspect is, of course, I just spoke about that. Merely ticking the boxes is not expected. That is not true compliance. At best, it can be called as apparent compliance. Now, according to me, I always say that there are three stages of compliance. One is apparent compliance, one second is adequate compliance, and the third is absolute compliance. So, as a board, simply accepting whatever the management has given is simply an apparent compliance, that is simply ticking the boxes. The second one is, oh, this is the industry standard, therefore I have complied with that. Then it is adequate standard, adequate compliance. But what is expected from the board will be absolute compliance. That means if this is the standard, can we do much better? Can we set a higher benchmark? Can we do better than what we did last time? So if this type of benchmarks to be kept for one's own self, and therefore that will also demonstrate the integrated value over a period of time within the enterprise. So in the long run, the company will be able to reach a higher standard than what the regulatory standards have been setting. The next aspect is that one should not consider this, as reporting as mere report, because it is actually an X-ray of the company's sustainable health. The health of the company, whether in the long run, how it is going to be sustainable, what type of care the people are being taken care of, how type of efforts we are putting to protect the planet as such. And it should not be only for the investors, but it will be for the entire world. So that is why from the shareholder perspective to the stakeholder perspective have to be seen. So with these expectations, of course, these expectations also will keep on varying from time to time. So the point I would like to play one small video, which what I try to say is that whatever is being submitted by the management should not be accepted, because what we see or what we hear may be off truth. But unless we do a detailed, what you call some sort of a, I don't like to use the word investigation, but some sort of a probing has to be done during the, examination of the details given by the management. Otherwise, we will be lead to some sort of a mistaken disclosure. So let me just play this video.
Scat! Come here. Come here, you. I'll fix you. You. Yeah. That's a cat! Get out of here. Come here, you. You're gonna figure it away. Now I got you. Come on. Now I got it. It couldn't be. Or could it? Now, you stay here. You be a good boy, you. Now sit there. Here you are, gentlemen. Hot dog. When it comes to cooking, I'm the cat's meow. Sit down.
Oh, but I'm not tired. I'll just stand while you eat.
Sit down with your head on or off.
You talk us into it.
Eat.
Did you hear anything?
Yeah, I did. Yes. Sit down and eat.
Eat. Gesundheit.
Eat. Well. Whoa!
I killed it. I killed it, but...
This just can't be.
Forget the mustard.
So you are the perpetrator of this. Sit down and eat.
Sit down.
A pleasure. Thank you.
So what the video tries to show is that what you see and what you hear may not be true. So you have to do a detailed, prove into whatever disclosure are being given to the board, and board has to ensure that it is comprehensive and it is complying with the regulations. Moving on to that, in order to facilitate better compliance, as a regulator, we have also formed the industry standard forum through which we get inputs from the market participants how to improvise the standards for implementation. And SEBI is always in the consultative process. We do improvements. In addition to that, in the budget announcement also, a working group has been formed, especially covering this aspect of sustainability reporting to facilitate ease of doing business. So the regulator is always in touch with the market participants and to see how best we can do that so that it benefits not only the shareholders but also the stakeholders at large. So before I end, I will just play one more very short video, which is from the humorous point of view that how one has to be self-disciplined, otherwise what will happen. So it's the last slide, just to
डिस्को में जब ये गाना बजेगा ऑन द फ्लोर आना पड़ेगा लुंगी को उठाना पड़ेगा सब करके दिखाना पड़ेगा.
So the point is, if it is irresponsible behavior, it will lead to self-destruction. That is what this slide tries to show, that we have to be first responsible, show a responsible behavior, and then there will be proper, acceptance by all. That's all from my end, and I thank IOD, and I hope I am within the timelines given to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sundaresan. That was both a sobering reminder of our responsibility and the desire, the balance between our values and our aspirations and whether or not we put action behind that. And so thank you for the amazing work that SEBI is doing to help all of our corporations to improve and to really, I appreciated how you said that our corporation's conscience is reflected in our sustainability, is in the putting action behind these goals that we have. So thank you for helping all of these corporations to do that more easily. I think also putting that visual behind it is really important for us to be double checking, like the work that the organizations on whose boards we sit, are they really doing what they say they're doing? So thank you for that reminder. And I believe we are ready to move on to our next speaker. So again, thank you, Mr. Sundaresan, for your time and for your insights. Our next speaker is Mr. Pradeep Ramakrishnan, Executive Director, the International Financial Services Centers Authority. Mr. Ramakrishnan is a qualified company secretary, and he brings over 2 decades of experience from his distinguished tenure at SEBI, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, where he served as general manager. And during his time at SEBI, he played a key role in managing the Department of Debt and Hybrid Securities, and earlier he oversaw the Compliance and Monitoring Division. Prior to his regulatory career, Mr. Ramakrishnan was associated with the Madras Fertilizers and Qatari Petrochemicals as well. Mr. Ramakrishnan will share his insights on the theme, ESG reporting standards and guidelines for listed companies. Please welcome Mr. Pradeep Ramakrishnan.
Hi, thanks, Jennifer. I hope everyone is able to hear my voice, and it's an honor for me because my mentor, Mr. Sundaresan, was the earlier speaker. So it's an honor to be in the same room as him. And thanks a lot to IOD for calling IPSCA to this meeting. So what I will try to give you today is that while the issues about companies and also about what they're going to do for ESG, I would like to give a short lowdown on what IPSCA has done as far as ESG is concerned, because we are a new jurisdiction and a lot of people are, they want to know what is so different and what is it that we have done. You told the audience that I have handled green related issues in India through SEBI. So it was a pleasure to work for almost 22 years at SEBI, learned a lot. And a couple of things where I was privileged to work in SEBI was on the BRSR, and which Mr. Sundaresan gave a very detailed presentation on. And secondly, on the green bond framework, which is probably what you can call as a taxonomy. And the other issue, which is pretty burning and continue to be burning as long as you're going to have ESG as a standpoint, is greenwashing. So I was privileged to be part of, sort of framing those do's and don'ts for greenwashing, which for corporate India. So why is ESG important is a question which is no longer relevant, because ever since 2013, when the Companies Act brought in a very interesting section, which was not hitherto there in any other earlier Companies Acts, because this year, the last century itself, we have had, until the new Companies Act, we had 3 Companies Acts. One was in 1913, one was in 1956, the other one was in 2013. And the reason why this 2013 Act is important as far as Indian companies are concerned is because of the fact that this is the first time a Companies Act says that the directors shall ensure that they do business, and they also should sort of ensure that they do business while taking care of the society and environment. So sustainability is not an option anymore. Sustainability is perhaps the only way in which you can sort of do business. So that is a very important, huge shift, in fact, if you ask me, from what it was earlier. So, and the laws, rules, and regulations are all drafted from that. Ever since India signed the Paris Accord, that was in 2015, while non-financial reporting in India has been there has been prevalent since 1999, 2000, when SEBI brought in the corporate governance regulations. And it was on, earlier it was essentially about governance. That was how it started. The G part was first given importance after the ENS started kicking in. And that started in 2011 with the National Voluntary Guidelines, which was sort of, brought in by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. SEBI, a very dynamic regulator, was the first to bring in such rules and regulations, and the BRR, which was also explained by Mr. Sundaresan earlier. And then it gave way to the BRSR. While I want to give a small nugget of information, because I was privileged to be part of the team that prepared the BRSR, the report initially also, because we work with Niti Aayog, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, and a few other institutions. Very interestingly, during the course of our preparing this report, we met a few related parties, interested parties, what you can call, and we came to know that small companies, small MSMEs were actually rating good on E&S parameters. And we were puzzled to know why. So I think probably in the mid-noughties, there was an undercover reporter of the New York Times who went to Taiwan and China. And these were outsourcing manufacturing hubs of very large companies, very large footwear companies, which are household names. And he found that these companies were getting their products manufactured in extremely small, what you can say, coupes, where small children were for less than $1 a day, 7 floors below the ground, they were sort of manufacturing these shoes. Now, while I may have a green building, I may have, I may ensure that I take care of everything, may even be taking care of my employees at the head office. But the whole supply chain thing came into the fore after an expose. And then these companies were sort of taken to task, and then probably all companies started looking at supply chain also, which is what the BRSR core also says. Now, today, as far as the IFSCA is concerned, we had the benefit of what we did at SEBI. And we also had the benefit of not needing to invent a taxonomy, right? So in India, we have the BRSR as far as reporting is concerned. We also have the green bond framework as far as a taxonomy is concerned. So presently, India does not have an official taxonomy. The present budget, the Honorable Finance Minister said that we are going to maybe come out with a taxonomy for companies, which might be there before the next budget. But the government has already come out with a sovereign green bond. And in the sovereign green bond, they have followed the taxonomy, which has been laid on, a principle-based taxonomy, which has been laid on by the ICMA, the International Capital Market Association. So SEBI, while it brought in the framework for green bonds in 2017, it adopted the ICMA definition of what is a green bond. And it also brought in the concept of blue and yellow bonds, and also transition bonds. Now, transition bonds are interesting because a lot of companies need to sort of contribute to the transition. And we have, ever since we signed the Paris Accord, we have sort of said that, okay, we will ensure that we will transit to a particular sphere before we go to the ultimate goal of net zero by 2070. So the first thing that we have set ourselves as a target and is 2030. And we have made 3 promises. And these are all called nationally determined contributions. And these 3 promises are, first, we have said that we'll ensure that we create a carbon sink where almost 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide will get absorbed. So it's essentially afforestation, towards which the government has brought in a very unique concept called green credits, right? And of course, it's still not getting fully operationalized, but over a period of time it will. But that is something which is unique to India. While carbon credits is something which, of course, all of us know, green credit is something which is different and it is essentially for the purpose of afforestation. And of course, a lot of companies can also gain green credits because of by participating in that. The second thing what we have said is that we will ensure that renewable energy is an important source as far as energy is concerned, which through renewable sources rather. So we have said that we'll at least be 40% of what we need. See, presently, almost 70% of our energy needs come through coal. It's not different probably in the US, for example, where almost 45% comes from coal. A lot of other countries also initially. See, one of the things which has been very unique and different about ESG is that everyone has sort of revised their promises, right? So every country made a lot of promises. They went back and they found that many of them, they are unable to comply with what they promised. Take Great Britain, for example. They said they will sell only electric cars by 2030, right? And they have pushed that to 2035 because they found that within a period of 6 to 9 months of the law becoming operational, there are issues with actually making it practical. If you take the other concept of incentivization, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is something which has riled a lot of automobile manufacturers and a lot of other manufacturers, which is having impact on companies' bottom lines. So they've said that the same incentive should be sort of given to companies which are companies which are sort of, for example, manufacturing in China, right? So these are all things which are going on. So what I would like to say is that ESG is probably one concept which will be the most evolving. And the impact of geopolitics on ESG is something which is non-perennial. If you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, which started 2 years ago. Now, once the whole war started, the issue was for Europe. And there are countries like Czechoslovakia who are getting almost 100% of their energy needs from Russia. Belgium, for example, 60%. So they found it difficult when they said that you can't buy anything from Russia. So what we did was, India was asked to take crude from Russia, refine it, and sell it back to the European nations. And secondly, the definition of green itself underwent a complete change, much to the chagrin of Belgium. The definition of green was changed to include nuclear energy. Nuclear plants got reopened. A few coal plants got reopened. So the whole concept of ESG and a lot of things in the media, I don't know if many of you would have followed the media, particularly the Western media, there were articles written against ESG, right? And as to why it's not what it was thought out to be, right? So in this scenario, when the IFSCA came into being in 2019, initially when the rules and regulations for bonds were sort of framed, green finance, sustainable bonds was framed, then the quandary was as to whether you have to invent a taxonomy or you accept something that is readily accepted. One of the things we found when I was in SEBI was that investment is always the prerogative of the investor, particularly green investment. The second thing was also that maybe a bit of greenium was always interesting, because I'll tell you in a few minutes from now as to how that has also undergone a change. Now, the concept of greenium was also something that was imperative at some point in time. So that was one of the reasons as to why the green bond concept maybe did not take off as much as it should have, despite SEBI aligning it with a much accepted taxonomy. So what we thought was, we will say that we'll accept SEBI's taxonomy, but we'll also accept a few more taxonomies which are accepted around the world, right? Which are followed around the world, because essentially an investment is a contract between the investor and the investee. So if suppose there is a person in Europe, the person may be comfortable with an European model, an European taxonomy. A person in Japan may be comfortable with an ASEAN taxonomy. ICMA taxonomy is accepted. Maybe someone like Singapore or something like that. The ISSP has now come. Now, if you look at even the taxonomies internationally, which companies used to follow, we had the CDP, we had the GRI. Now, all those things have got converged into the ISSB, right? The ISSB, IFRS S1 and S2 is what is most commonly followed. So what we have done at IPSCA is that we have said that, okay, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm not going to invent a taxonomy now. All the things that are accepted internationally, we will specify 4 or 5 things which are internationally accepted, including SEBI's taxonomy. Whatsoever, which company finds it interesting to sort of take over, and if you're able to convince your investors, please go ahead. Now, this approach has led to almost $14 billion of green, sustainable, social, and sustainability-linked bonds being raised from this jurisdiction. Particularly sustainability-linked bonds, which are perhaps, if you ask me, the most dangerous of the green bond family, because of the fact that a lot of greenwashing is what happens there, right? So what we are also trying to do is that we are trying to bring some do's and don'ts, give some examples around greenwashing, because interestingly, if you look at the Deutsche Bank example, the Goldman Sachs example, the Melon example, and maybe if you even look at certain very commonly accepted follies like what the FIFA did at the World Cup, soccer, or maybe what Burger King did with its Whopper burger, where they all claimed these things are sustainable, but it was found out by the regulators to be not sustainable, and action was taken on greenwashing. So today, the regulators, biggest thing as far as regulators are concerned is something to ensure the credibility of a jurisdiction, and that is possible only by preventing greenwashing. While bringing rules and regulations for greenwashing is something like what we can keep on talking till the cows come home. It's pretty difficult, right? But what you can do is you can draw principles around greenwashing. That is what we have tried to do. We are consulting on that, and hopefully it should come. I said a few minutes ago that I'll also talk about the fact that how ESG, there has been a metamorphosis as far as ESG is concerned, particularly the concept of greenium, right? Now, what exactly is this greenium? Of course, many of you know, but for those who don't, I'll just try to explain. Essentially, it's about the fact that I will be able to sort of forego a premium for investing in a project which I consider to be green. Essentially, a semblance of altruism is what is sort of built into that investment. And I'm willing to take a hit to the extent of a few basis points. Now, while this was good, this happened. A lot of institutional investors initially started doing it. It took the bait. People started doing it. Companies were happy to borrow for green. For a period of time, there has been no convergence between the so-called return for a brown bond and maybe a green bond. So what has happened is that the concept of greenium is extinct in many markets. There's a very interesting study by OECD, which if you're interested, you can see on the website, which sort of deals with the concept of greenium and says that, okay, it's all but extinct in many nations around the world because no one wants to contribute just by losing a return. Why should I do it? It's your job to be green. It's your job to be sustainable. So for companies, that is something which you have to sort of look at. So maybe borrowing and expecting a greenium may not be an everyday affair as far as as far as bonds, green bonds are concerned. So that is something which you'll have to look at. One thing which Mr. Sundaresan very nicely harped upon, and which we also at IFSCA are trying to sort of do as far as green bonds are concerned, is the fact that there should be credibility built around a borrowing which is for a sustainable purpose. And how can that be ensured? First is you need to ensure that the disclosures are certified by an independent certified. So companies need to ensure that they take that independent certification. That is like a sign on. You need to take it. The second one, which is important for you to do, is to ensure that there are disclosures. Essentially, where are you going to deploy? How do you say that it is green? And what is that is contained in the certification? These are things that have to be disclosed in the pre-issue PPM, right? Now, post-issue, because it does not stop. And I'll give you a very interesting example in that of a development impact bond, which took off and spluttered, and then it stopped, and then it took off and whatnot. Now, in case of a development impact bond, I'm like sort of taking money where I'm going to deploy it for a very altruistic purpose, a social purpose. Now, if you take the example of South Africa, what happened was why the development impact banks bond started with a bang. Over a period of time, companies stopped giving those disclosures which the investors wanted. So it's essentially like anyway, you plan to give this money to me. It was more like a donation, and hence I'm not going to disclose. So after a point in time, the whole thing about the DIB started fettering away. So we have recognized that as much as SEBI has also done. And we have said that there should be continuous disclosures as long as you are going to use the bond until you sort of return the money. Now, there is one very interesting thing which SEBI also has, but we don't have it as of now, is that under a do's and don'ts for greenwashing, SEBI says that in case there is something which you find whereby a company has been caught greenwashing, a company is not using it for the purpose, you go back to the debenture holders and return the money. So while we don't have it, we will sort of endorse it if some company wants to do that. Two other points which I would like to say. Now, these are all as far as the entities in IFSCA are concerned. Now, as far as we are probably the only jurisdiction in the world which has mandated banks to borrow, and they are supposed to borrow at least 5. They're supposed to sort of lend 5% for sustainable purposes. So this has led to almost $1.5 billion of money being lent by almost 30 odd banking units here for sustainable purposes. The third piece, which we are also trying to sort of fix, is also the ESG funds. So there has been one ESG fund already. We have also said that in case your assets under management are more than 3 million, then you will have to also make certain disclosures as far as sustainability are concerned. So this is what, as far as IFSCA is concerned, and anyway, I'm going to join a panel discussion, so maybe I will stop here. So what I would like to say is that this essentially is an evolving concept. It will continue, and there is also, and the reason why it's an evolving concept is because of the fact that in many places, what is green for you is not green for me. And in most other places also, E is actually given a lot more importance than S and G. So that is also something which has to be taken care of because it is holistic. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ramakrishnan. I think that ending was a great summary and also a challenge for all of us as we try to balance the E, the G, and the S in the middle. And I now want to move on to our panel session on this theme, which this was such a great foundation. So thank you for the definitions, for the clarity, and for the challenge. And we are now moving on to ESG and the future ahead. We have a great lineup of speakers who are going to share more about the Indian ESG landscape and international best practices. So I'd like you to please join me in welcoming our speakers. I want to make a brief announcement that unfortunately Mr. Kapil Malhotra will not be joining us, and he was just held up and could not be with us today. But please join me in welcoming our other speakers. Mr. Giridhar Sanjeevi, former Executive Vice President and CFO at the Indian Hotels Company Limited, will be chairing the session. A chartered accountant and alumnus of IIM Ahmedabad, Mr. Sanjeevi has over 30 years of experience in finance and commercial roles across consumer business, financial services, retail, and pharma in Asia and Europe. He has worked in India, Dubai, Singapore, and London. And before joining the Indian Hotels Company Limited, he was CFO for South Asia and business head for multiple countries at Merck & Company. He began his career at ITC Limited and also served as the Global Business Development Director at Diageo. I apologize if I said that wrong, covering M&A and strategy. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Sanjeevi. I also want to introduce our panelist. You've already met him, Mr. Pradeep Ramakrishnan, the Executive Director at IFSCA. And also, please join me in welcoming our final panelist, Mr. Pyarali Jamal. Mr. Jamal is a London-based ESG and sustainable finance specialist with over 20 years of experience. He spent 10 years in EY's transaction advisory services in Canada, the UK, and globally, holding roles such as Vice President, Global Network Coordinator, and COO and Director. He's a member of the Sustainability Committee at ICAEW, the Advisory Council for the Center for Building Sustainable Value, and the Research Advisory Council for the Institute for Sustainable Finance. Thank you, Mr. Jamal, for joining us today. And now I'd request our panel chair, Mr. Sanjeevi, to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, I think, for the kind introduction. And I think you just heard the two speakers before talking about what regulators are doing. I think one of the things that I like to begin when we talk about board responsibilities and company responsibilities on ESG, as to what is the stance on ESG? Because ultimately, I think the stance on ESG is very important, actually. Some companies are very happy to sort of keep the stance at a compliance level, which means that they do what the regulators say. And that's fine. You know, I think the only point and kind of watchword is that you heard Pradeep and Mr. Sundaresan speak earlier. The regulators are increasing the requirements for companies in terms of compliance. So therefore, I think just doing what the regulator says is probably not too bad, actually, not too bad. Having said that, for sustainable ESG practices to be embedded into the company, and to sort of look at value creation as an example, I think ultimately ESG has to be embedded as part of strategy. So that is a second stance in terms of what companies can do in terms of ESG. That is stance which is based on strategy. And finally, of course, the stance which is based on purpose. Indian Hotels is part of the Tata Group, and Tata Group has certain principles around which is based on purpose. When the pandemic hit in 2020, when we were near zero revenues, as an example, as a CFO, the message that I got from our chairman, Mr. Chandrasekharan, and the late Mr. Tata was that no employee should be fired. So that's a very big stance in terms of ESG as purpose, where I think, there was a mention that the S and the G are equally important, and not just the E, actually. And I think the Tata Group has consistently kind of demonstrated that it kind of works on the S and the G as well in a very significant way, actually. And hence, I think as you look at these three stances, I think board involvement from a compliance level is, of course, onerous. But in a way, I think that is kind of the bare minimum, actually. I think the reality is that the board needs to get involved in kind of understanding the strategies, because I think businesses are being reshaped, actually. There are companies which have completely pivoted. One great example that I admire is a company called Ørsted in Netherlands, actually, which kind of pivoted completely to wind energy, giving up its existing businesses. So business pivots are also happening, which means a change of strategy is not something which is an option. It is something which has to be done in terms of ensuring the longevity of such companies, actually. So ESG strategy to me is very critical. And so the board willy-nilly would need to get involved with the management in terms of thinking of these, actually. And you have seen some great examples in terms of how companies have thought through it. Unilever, for instance, Paul Polman definitely said in 2008 or 9 when he took over as a chairman, saying that we will double our revenues, but we will halve our environmental impacts. And now this is now becoming every CEO is now saying one form or the other in terms of such statement that growth needs to be balanced with sustainability, actually. But of course, there are trade-offs involved, because the trade-offs are such that some of the pivots that we're talking about are not easy, actually. And when pivots are not easy, I think ultimately, we are accountable to the shareholders, and investors do expect returns, actually. And there have been difficult cases. Even Unilever faced a takeover threat because some of the investors were not happy with the way performance was under Paul Polman. In fact, the new chairman has kind of substantially reduced the pledges that the Unilever made under Paul Polman, and kind of come to much more simpler set of sustainability initiatives, actually. And you saw Faber, who is the head of ISSB, who was heading Danone at that point of time. He got fired because the returns in Danone was inadequate, actually. So therefore, I think the path to ESG, the path to adopting ESG and sustainable strategies is not easy, actually. And I think what is important is to do it step by step, making sure that all stakeholders are fully aligned, actually. Now, in terms of board responsibilities, I think you saw the two speakers talk about the increasing regulatory oversight in terms of what compliance is requiring. But now activist investors are also now taking a very hard stand in terms of responsibilities of directors. We saw two cases internationally in Exxon, for instance, where Exxon, the activist investors were able to take out, hedge funds were able to take out 3 board members and appoint their own people onto the board. And we saw Shell, where the directors have been held personally liable, and there's a suit which has been filed by Client Earth. In fact, I know the former vice chairman of Shell, and I was asking her, how was it being sued by Client Earth? And it was not funny. In fact, she retired, and mercifully, Client Earth decided to take her name off the litigation, actually. So which means that it is not just about a fiduciary responsibility. The fiduciary responsibility on the board in terms of helping drive ESG is one thing, but the responsibility in terms of personal liabilities is also very, very significant, actually. So hence, I think the board oversight on ESG is not something to be trifled, and this is now coming, and gradually, I think it is coming. Like BRSR, let me go back to BRSR. BRSR has given a big fillip, actually. In fact, before BRSR came in, I think it was voluntary reporting under BRR, and therefore companies were reporting. And I don't think the board spent too much time. In fact, most BRR reports in the Indian context were run by the sustainability departments, the CSR departments, which were mostly in the HR function, to be honest, actually. So BRR report was a report which the HR function would kind of put it up. It was a voluntary submission, and I don't think the board got into any level of oversight. Whereas with the BRSR, especially the requirement of SEBI to do reasonable assurance, because it's not limited assurance. In fact, the SEBI requirement of reasonable assurance goes beyond what many of the international jurisdictions have required. And I think as a CFO, when I was at Indian Hotels, I think we spent a lot of time in terms of coming to grips with what is reasonable assurance when you're measuring some things actually. Because what we found was that the practices in one hotel with respect to one area was completely different from practices in another hotel actually. Not because of intent, but because that's the way it had grown. And how do you kind of bring the same level of diligence and rigor that financial reporting has got actually? And as CFO, one of the things that I would say is that, there is a CEO CFO certification that I had to sign every year on the financial reports. And I was very clear that I could not sign a CEO CFO certificate on the financial side and say that I will not take ownership on the sustainability report, which is attached to the financial report actually, which means there are significant implications even for managements as CEO and CFOs as they sign off on those certifications actually. And therefore BRSR clearly has forced companies and boards to look at the landscape as required by SEBI in terms of the different disclosure requirements and how ready the companies are in terms of being prepared to measure and do things report right actually. I think Mr. Sundaresan alluded to the fact that some of these reports could be optically correct, but I don't think companies can afford to be optically correct here actually. I think one big takeaway in the BRSR, which I think companies are reckoning, is ultimately, I think the whole subject of ESG is very vast actually. And companies need to focus on what is material to them. And it is very interesting. About a year ago, I was in a seminar conducted by one of the big four, which was kind of giving away awards to different companies on their BRSR submissions actually. And the GRI head of India actually said that the materiality report that materiality matrix that the companies are publishing is inadequate. They're not well thought through actually. So I think one of the most important things that the boards need to focus on is fundamentally on the materiality matrix to make sure that the materiality matrix reflects the right material issues that are facing the organization. Like for instance, and these material issues can change. Take the example, you saw a news report 2 days ago of Amazon signing up nuclear power arrangements for power actually. In fact, I think for many of these companies, scope 2 in terms of power may not have been a big issue, but with new data demands and artificial intelligence, suddenly power is a massive issue. And now they're signing up to nuclear power because that is zero emissions, minimizing emissions actually. So I think what is critical yesterday may not be critical today, but very important to understand that the materiality matrix has to be very well thought through. And this is where I think the board needs to sit down with management and understand what the material issues are. And when we talk of material issues, one of the things that we have been doing is that we also talk to external people like our suppliers, like our investors, and understand from them as to what the material issues are. So getting the materiality matrix right and understanding materiality for companies is, in my view, the starting point, because that will tell you what are the areas to focus on. And once you're clear on what areas to focus on, then you can go about in terms of implementing strategies to deal with that actually. Now, I think clearly speaking, climate change, environment clearly has taken the center stage in terms of ESG, along with, of course, the social and governance issues, which unfortunately have been a bit nebulous actually. And I think net zero targets are being set by companies. But I think, to be honest, if you talk to many companies in terms of their net zero targets, which talk about 2050, 2035, 2040, etc., I don't think the companies are thinking through the net zero targets. And the other accusation about net zero also is that it's too far out. If I set a net zero target last year and I've retired 3 months ago, where is the accountability towards those net zero targets? So net zero targets are good philosophically in terms of going towards the Paris Accord. It's very critical actually, but the net zero needs to be backed up by clear near-term targets actually, which is the decarbonization targets actually. So personally as CFO, I was giving a lot of importance to decarbonization targets where you could measure over 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, in terms of on all the material issues, how are you progressing? And you can track them actually. And one of the things I was kind of advocating for companies in India, and we did it in our company as well, is to sign up to SBTi. Because SBTi is a lovely platform which allows companies to give their pledges in terms of their decarbonization targets and report against it in a very transparent fashion actually. So therefore, I think the one caution that I do want to tell the audience listening in is that net zero is great from a board perspective in terms of setting the long-term vision in terms of net zero. It has to be backed up by clear near-term decarbonization targets, actually. And the other thing which is not being talked about as well, at least in the Indian context, is the physical risk, actually. While people talk about climate risk, the decarbonization, emissions risk, actually, the physical risk is not talked about at all. And physical risk is a very, very important risk. In fact, many of you, one of the earliest signs of climate risk in terms of company P&Ls are in terms of insurance premiums going up significantly. And I do not know how many of you know about the Teesta Dam disaster, which was based on this glacial lake outburst flood, which happened, the GLOF, which happened about a year and a half back. And the entire dam was gave away, resulting in significant loss of physical assets, actually. And you have seen other cases where significant physical asset losses have taken place, actually. And the important thing is insurance coverage in many of these cases is not available. If you're in the US, for instance, homeowners in California and Florida don't have insurance covers, actually. So physical risk is now becoming a very, very important thing. And as you look at these risks, ultimately, I think, as Mr. Sundaresan talked about the integrated reporting, where you kind of consider these risks into your financials, I think the S1 and S2 standards of the ISSB are very, very important, actually. India has signed up to IOSCO, which means SEBI at some stage will have to define the adoption of S1 and S2 into the Indian context, actually. And it has fundamental implications on the P&L and the balance sheet. If, for instance, you believe that your asset has a useful life of 50 years or 60 years, but there is a coastal risk which says that you could be underwater in the next 30 years, your residual life of the asset changes, and therefore your impact on the P&L changes, actually. So the balance sheets are getting impacted, the P&Ls are getting impacted, and S1 and S2, while not yet mandatory in India, are something that boards need to think about. And I think that is going to be very critical, actually. And the other big thing that I noticed when I was a CFO was that, while people talk about mitigation, ultimately the reality is that we are not anywhere close to the 1.5 degrees of Paris targets. And therefore, I think what we are facing now are adaptation challenges. When the floods hit Chennai in 2015, even our hotels were impacted, actually. And so we had to spend monies in terms of getting the hotel up and running because there was flooding in the basement or on the ground floor, actually. But more importantly, not just our hotels were impacted, our supply chains were impacted, actually. Our fish vendors and all other vendors, many of the other vendors were impacted, which means we had to work with them. Our employees' housing was impacted. So we had to provide financial assistance to employees in terms of dealing with it. So the adaptation costs are real, actually. Today, the financial statements do not require you to make an advance provision in anticipation of an adaptation cost, but adaptation costs can hit you if there's a flood or some of these events which take place, actually. So hence, I think there are significant financial implications which does come in when it comes to ESG, actually. And I think boards have a big responsibility. And ultimately, I think the results of the company should reflect, in a way, the true financial results of the company, actually. And let's see how this evolves in India, actually. Now, the other sustainability areas that are important, and I think the previous speakers have alluded to it. We spoke about supply chain resilience in the case of Chennai, where we talked about how supply chains were impacted. We talked about, I think, Pradeep talked about the Taiwanese example of human rights. In Bangladesh, the famous Rana Plaza episode, where again, clothing manufacturers were using, got very, very tough working conditions for workers, actually, at $1, as Pradeep said. DEI is becoming very critical. Bribery and anti-corruption is a very big agenda on ESG, actually. Data, AI, cybersecurity, that's becoming a very, very important area. In fact, I think what is happening in India is that in India, if you are hit with a cybersecurity incident, you have an obligation to report, actually. And now with the data privacy laws which are coming in, I think the implications in terms of companies to ensure the right use of data of customers, privacy is becoming very, very critical, actually. In fact, it is now one of the most important issues. The government has not yet finally notified or rather brought the data privacy bill into being, but they will do so, actually. Chandrasekharan, the minister, has said that they will come out now. And I think in the next year or so, that should come out. That's becoming a very, very important thing. Tax transparency. We published, when I was a CFO, the tax transparency report, in terms, no longer is tax avoidance a good thing. Ultimately, we have to talk about paying our fair share of taxes actually. And finally, I think one of the things which is becoming very critical is the whole question of executive compensation actually. Increasingly, they are becoming part of our KPIs, the managing director's KPIs, the leadership team KPIs, and it flows all the way through. You can't have an executive compensation not linked to ESG parameters. And these are things that the board needs to really think about. One thing that I also noticed when I was CFO was investor concerns actually. Investors at this point of time, I think for the company that I work for at least, I think the integration investing style is what I saw, which means that we were not a company which was exclusionary. We were not coal or cigarettes or alcoholic beverage company where investors said we will not invest. In a hotels company, I think the exclusionary style was not applicable, but companies were interested to know what we were doing actually. And what really helped was a very good publication of all our ESG initiatives under what we called as PATYA actually. And that gave full disclosure in terms of all our activities actually. And so investors look forward to it in terms of what we are doing. So communication with investors has been very important. And ESG funds have come into the cap table. It's still small today. I think investors understand that it is a staggered approach. It is not overnight change actually. But nevertheless, I think they would like to see progress actually. So communicating with investors on ESG is now definitely becoming important. So finally, I think we have the other speakers as well. I would say that from an ESG perspective, from a board responsibility perspective, and from a management responsibility perspective, I would say there are few elements of resilience which become very critical actually. One is what I would call as building physical assets resilience, the risk that your property is safe. I think that's becoming important. Building financial resilience, earnings protection, balance sheet protection is becoming important. Business model pivots. If you need to do business model pivots, I think you need to start planning them. Like supply chain, like scope 3 is a very big area of discussion actually. And companies will have to willy-nilly start changing their approach to their value chains partners actually. Maybe it will lead to consolidation. We saw an automobile industry a few years ago where the aftermarket consolidated with fewer vendors so that they were bigger vendors and they could then have the ability to kind of do what we want them to do, to be honest, actually. So we expect significant supply chain changes to happen, actually, and business model pivots can happen. Building regulatory resilience, I think that's also very important, actually. Ultimately, regulatory resilience, you don't want to fall with the regulator. And similarly, if you're in a hard-to-abate industry like steel or aluminum, and exporting to Europe, you don't want to pay those CBAM kind of tariffs, which can be as much as 25% of your business, actually. So therefore, I think regulatory resilience is very critical, actually. And finally, I think it's reputational resilience, actually. I think no company can say that they will ignore ESG, actually. In fact, I think you will be called out in terms of ignoring regulatory, called out if you're not kind of walking the talk and kind of doing what it requires. So reputational resilience is also important, actually. So these were some thoughts that I had. And what I will do is that I will pass it on now to Pradeep back in terms of his perspective. And then we will go to the last speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Giridhar. And it's nice to hear from someone who's been at the forefront of it all when you have actually handled these matters. Because being from a regulator, because I've been with the regulator there and a regulator here ever since this whole ESG thing started catching up, and when we started bringing in rules and regulations for ESG. But if you ask me, personally speaking, it's important for regulators to handhold companies to ensure that they comply. So one is, of course, the fact that if there is non-compliance, I believe that in case there is non-compliance or in case there is greenwashing, while there may be penalties and other things, the people who actually will be taking action against these companies are the investors. Because today the biggest risk any company can sort of suffer is not financial, is not cyber. While these are important, but reputational risk is actually something which sort of takes care of a lot of other risks, and there is something which is very interesting. And recently, it was very compounded. In a few cases recently, we have seen, particularly in FMCG companies, where the sugar levels and salt levels were sort of highlighted, and where the companies, instead of sort of going back to the drawing board and reformulating the product what they did was they tried to fight it out, and that did not give a very good, that left a very bad taste in the mouth for them. And in fact, that led to even the regulator getting down to business and saying that, okay, you will have to change things. So that has actually led to a sea change in the labeling of foods in India. So that's a cascading effect. That's a butterfly effect, as I could actually sort of call, as far as non-compliance with these things. And so the reputational risk is something which is very important. Now, you made a very interesting point, as far as, supply chain, right? And also the fact. So I remember, because of course, while we don't have a specific taxonomy here, and we have said that you will have to sort of comply with the taxonomy of which of your choice, I would like to just go back to what we did in India when I was in India. So that was the thing when the whole BRSR core thing was brought out. Now, essentially, that requires you to give an assurance on probably 1/3 or 1/4 of the most of all the parameters in the BRSR. And that is to sort of give credence to the disclosures, and also the fact that the company stands by the disclosures. Because in 1991, India made a very important call. And in 1992, with the advent of SEBI, another important call was actually made that we will move away from merit-based regulation to disclosure-based regulation, right? So that was, and then that means that the disclosures should be credible, right? And that one point which you also made, again, I'm taking a thread from what you have mentioned, because I have to give a regulatory perspective, and that is on social disclosures, right? The social disclosures are something which, in fact, amongst these three, social disclosures are actually given the most drift, the shortest drift. So the G part took off in India ever since 1999 with the Kumaril Mangalam Birla Committee report, and it came out with the corporate governance provisions being sort of brought in. So the non-financial disclosures, as I told you, the governance thing has been there for quite some time. It's been carried on for quite some time. Disclosures have been made. Boards have been made more independent. There are committees, there are independent directors who meet separately and or whatnot. And then after the whole Paris Accord and the disclosures in the BRSR, the E part has actually become a lot more prevalent. Now, in fact, as we speak, whenever we speak of a green bond, we always allude it to something that is environmental, right? So that is what has also happened. Now, one thing what we have done during the course of our discussions is that, which I would again like to give a regulatory perspective, is what we are going to do next and what is it that companies should sort of look at. We had two things. One is we are looking at the carbon credit market. Now, carbon credits are something which are very interesting, and they are the places, and a carbon credit is something where a lot of nonsense has also happened, if I may be permitted to use that word. There has been a lot of greenwashing that has happened there. So it's important for the government to tread cautiously, which is why the government is taking baby steps there. While the CCTS was indeed brought in 2023, the very fact that the carbon credit has still not been notified as a financial instrument, which will enable its trade, despite the fact that Indian companies are the second largest exporters of carbon credits globally. So that is one piece which is important, and that will be sort of taken care of very shortly. But what we have done at IPSCA is that we had already formed a committee on the voluntary carbon market. A few reports have been there, and then we might be considering it once the government goes ahead with that. The second aspect which companies should consider, and what we are also trying to do, is transition finance. Now, transition finance is something which is a lot more, is more debated than even the normal green finance. And that is why that is important. It's important for regulators to also ensure that there is some hand-holding. Of course, now what exactly is transition? Now, the European Union, they have a granular definition of what is transition. So India has a broad definition as of now, and that is given by SEBI as of now. But what we have done is that we have a climate finance group, and we have divided the reports into two phases. The first phase is where they have given report on transition finance. It is available on their website, and in case people have comments. So while we want to add a lot more information about that in the report, but we have also tried to sort of tread the same path that we have already tread when it comes to green bonds, where we will be following a lot of international frameworks, a lot of international taxonomies. So that is something which will actually work in our favor, because if it has clicked for green bonds, why not it for transition bonds also? But that also needs to be, we also have to take into account the fact that there should be disclosures, and that is something which we are sort of ensuring. The second part of what the committee has to do, which we are trying to do, again, that will be for companies, is to make IFSCA as a climate finance hub. Now, what is a climate finance hub? A climate finance hub is a hub which is going to be a dial-in when it comes to climate finance. So that is a very ambitious target. But towards that, we have formed a group, and this group comprises of people from the industry, from associations, from NGOs, from inertia bodies, and all that. Hopefully, we will be able to, and we also have people from the government. And so we will be able to come out with a report, and with that report, we'll be able to take this whole ESG thing forward. So before I go, I just want to say one other thing, and that was also came out with when you were also talking about ESG. So when you're talking about your experiences in your company, I could also sort of relate to the fact as to how it has sort of evolved for a period of time and how continuous it is. So it is not a one-time thing, right? You may report it one time, right? But the fact is that it is sort of entwined into the business of the company. So which is why when I remember when I last time when the earlier talk when I began by saying that the Companies Act itself recognizes the fact that businesses have to be only sustainable. They can't be any other way, right? So hopefully what we are as a regulator are trying to do will help companies, Indian and international, who are going to do it, because we have already enabled direct listing. We expect a lot of international companies also to come and list very soon, and we are getting a lot of proposals. But over a period of time, they'll also be looking at this place for a green bond issue. And already we have had almost 40-50 issues of green bonds here. So which means that companies are sort of finding value in what we have prescribed as a taxonomy. So hopefully that should sort of take off. But we will continue to evolve, and we will continue to evolve with the world.
Thank you, Pradeep. I think that was lovely in terms of your perspective and what IFSCA is doing. I think what you covered in a talk today, first of all, to say that regulators need to help companies in terms of this transition. You spoke about the reputational importance, actually. You spoke about social governance. You talked about how the carbon credit markets are developing. You spoke about how transition finance will develop, and your ambition in terms of IFSCA being the climate finance helper, how it is quite a fascinating area of change, and I think which will impact everyone, actually. So thank you for your perspective. I think I take this opportunity to invite Mr. Jamal. Jamal, of course, brings in an international perspective, and over to you, Mr. Jamal.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, of course.
Yes, great. Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank the IOD for inviting me on to this webinar. It's great to be part of this. I do have some slides I want to share, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. But before I do that, I just want to give a little bit of context, even though Jennifer made a kind introduction. Just want to put in context where my views are coming from. You know, I've worked on ESG issues for over 20 years. And in particular, I've sat on the boards of 2 impact investors going back to 2009, when we had to look at these issues in detail before the regulations, before the Paris Agreement, and so on and so forth. And it's a learning process for all of us, obviously, including myself. And I've worked with investors, done ESG due diligence for them, not only in Europe, but I'm also advising investors and their portfolio companies in Canada and elsewhere. So I just want to give you a little bit of that background so that you know where my views are coming from. I'm going to share my slides with you now. Okay. Can everyone see that? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So this slide just shows the explosion, let's say, of regulations and disclosure requirements over the last 20 years. I'm not going to speak to it, and it doesn't obviously cover every region of the world, but it gives you a picture of what's happened. And some of you are already familiar with this, but you can see over the last 3-4 years what's happened. Okay. Now I'm going to cover, don't worry, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but if you're on boards and you're advising boards, you're working with boards, it's important to keep in mind what's going on in certain parts of the world where your businesses are operating. And Europe is a leader in this space. And being a leader also means you make a lot of mistakes because you're first off the bat out of the gate, let's say. So there are all these regulations, right? The CSRD, the CSDD, all these acronyms, which I won't talk you through. You may be familiar with some of them, but I want to draw your attention to a few of them. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive does affect 50,000 companies globally. And so some of the companies in India are going to be affected by this. Same with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which comes into effect in a few years, in 2027, but it will also affect companies outside of the EU. If you're raising money in the UK, in Europe, or if you're investing in companies in Europe, you will likely be within scope and subject to SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. So some of you may be already experienced in that or going through that process. And by the way, SFDR is going through review right now because it's had feedback from the market, and the regulators know that they always have to get feedback when they introduce something new. They need to fix things. We do have a EU taxonomy, which is going through revisions every so often. The green bonds and regulations, as you can see, and CBAM. CBAM is going to affect every part of the world that operates in Europe. And you could see what it refers to. Some of you may already be working on this and getting ready for it. We do know that India does supply many parts of the world, Indian companies, I should say. So your carbon footprint and the intensity of your products will be impacted by this mechanism, this regulation, when it takes effect. What's going on in the UK? Well, the UK arguably, or probably many would say, is second out of the gate in trying to implement regulations around sustainability and wider ESG. We do have the sustainability disclosure requirements affecting funds, similar to what SFDR is for Europe. You know, because we went through Brexit, we have to have our own version of some things. There is a anti-greenwashing rule. There is a TCFD reporting requirement that FCA authorized firms, most of them, are now within scope to do every year. Competitions Markets Authority has implemented a green claims code, and they've already identified, I don't think they've applied any fines yet, but a number of companies, about 20 companies, have been targeted. And some well-known brands, you know, they've gone to them and said, you need to clean up how you're making these claims about sustainability and, you know, greenwashing violations. And then our own UK green taxonomy has been in development. It's been delayed, and it's largely because it's a wait-and-see approach. As others have said, you know, why reinvent the wheel? Let's see how other taxonomies are working. UK companies are subject to taxonomies in other countries, particularly in Europe. So we're already subject to that. So what about in the US? A lot of companies in India do business in the US, something to be mindful of there if you're not already familiar. Well, the SEC came out with a watered down, scaled back set of disclosure requirements, and they scaled them back, as you can see, quite significantly. No requirement anymore for Scope 3 emissions or reporting, and on and on. You can see, I'm not going to read everything here. You could see how they scaled it back. And then when they introduced the scaled back version in March, they were taken to court by several states and a number of companies. And those companies and states said, well, the SEC does not have authority to, quote unquote, effectively regulate the controversial issue of climate change. Now the SEC, you know, went back and launched its defense, basically saying that, look, climate change does pose financial risk, and we have an obligation to make sure the companies that report under the SEC, you know, reporting requirements do report on climate risk. For many of us, we think that's obvious. Let's see how that unfolds. So there is pressure from Republican politicians, as you may have seen. I think particularly now with the political election cycle we're seeing more of that. And a number of asset managers around the world have had to pull back a little bit and let's say from this pressure. But some have also continued to do this, but have applied, let's say, green hushing tactics to do this. So they're not openly saying and using terms like ESG, but they are still proceeding with sustainability-related investments. And you've probably seen some. I know that Gary and others have mentioned some examples of investments in various red states that Goldman Sachs and others have made in renewable energy. But also, as they do that, they have to think of broader ESG issues. They're doing that in a more subtle way, and they're phasing in how they do that. Now, some states are moving forward anyway. California, about 3 weeks ago, passed this Bill 219, which encompasses some other existing bills. And basically, if you're of a certain size and you operate in California, regardless of where you're headquartered, this is the way it's being interpreted. then you will be subject to this. Now, I want to make one point clear, and by the way, Illinois and New York also are going down a similar path. So the US is going down this path in various pockets. I want to make one thing clear, though. If you are not within scope and you don't meet the requirements to report, you still may be questioned and asked by your client if you're a supplier to a company that does fall within scope of reporting requirements. And that may not happen overnight, but it will happen. So, and it's happening here in Europe. It's happening in Canada. I'm working with companies on that. Some of the work, by the way, I do is with CDP and Novista, which is a similar reporting platform. And we are seeing this. I don't work for CDP, by the way. I'm an advisor to them. Now, I think it's also important to look at some recent views that have been shared by asset owners, not managers, capital owners around the world, okay, around the world. And look at what they're saying. They're saying that majority of them said over the last 5 years, the ESG has become important. Over the last year, E, S, and G categories are important. And some of our speakers before me mentioned this. I'm telling you, I'm seeing this right now in terms of active reporting, due diligence, questioning, from investors and investor calls and so on and so forth, okay? There is money going to this. All 500 of these asset owners that were interviewed or surveyed said they're allocating a portion of their funds to this. How they're doing it, depends on their views on that. And they're saying that when it comes to material ESG issues, they identified a number of them. But as you can see, it's not all focused on E. It is focused on labor practices also and business ethics, which is broad, and we can talk about them in more detail in the Q&A if you'd like. And they're getting more involved. They're getting more involved in active ownership and speaking directly to some of their investees and having direct engagements. And then when they say, okay, well, what's really driving the implementation of their priorities? It is around, when they refer to here senior management leadership, what that really refers to is what Giri mentioned and what I strongly advocate companies that want to take this seriously, but to do it gradually and to do it pragmatically is you have to include ESG metrics in senior management compensation. And I would also argue in some ways at the board level, they have to be held accountable too, okay? Also followed by regulations, stakeholder pressure, and so on. Okay, just a couple more slides here and then I'm done. The important thing here at the board level, when you're looking at all the reporting requirements, and I've spoken with companies that say, we have 1,200 data points that we have to report on and this and that and whatever. I mean, it is frustrating. It is frustrating. But you really have to focus on outcome metrics, the decision useful outcome metrics. And I've given some some actually practical examples here that we can all relate to. But if you look at the bullet point where I say not output metrics, okay, it's not necessary to report on the things like the company has such and such policy, or that all employees are trained in, let's say, an anti-bribery and corruption policy, or that X amount has been invested in renewable energy projects. Those are a given. You have to do that in order to achieve the outcomes. In our first speaker spoke a lot about outcomes, right? So outcomes are really important. And the problem right now is, and I see this as I deal with regulators, I've given input on IFRS S1. I've spoken with IFRS about these things, that they and others, they themselves are learning, need to make these things clear, to focus on metrics that matter, decision useful outcome metrics. When you do that, you optimize resources, reporting, you reduce reporting burdens, make things more meaningful for yourselves, information more meaningful for your stakeholders, and especially if you provide comparables. And impact is a different story. Lastly, this has been covered, and this is my last slide. ESG is relatively new, as we know. People are still learning. Most are still learning, and including the regulators and so on, and others, the fund managers, everyone is still learning. Some have more experience than others, and that's why we're going through this iteration process and delays and greenwashing problems, okay? The data is limited. It's not that decision useful for many, and it's overwhelming. ROI from ESG initiatives is somewhat limited, but in the panel discussion, I'm happy to give some really good examples of what I've seen. The regulatory reporting requirements are still evolving, as we've discussed, and interoperability between jurisdictions is important. If you're operating in multiple countries and you've got to report to under different regulations, it's a pain. It's a real pain. So how do we, the way to focus on that, by the way, is to focus on decision useful outcome metrics. And if it's not measured, it's not managed, that goes back to including ESG linked, making compensation for senior managers linked to ESG metrics. And we've got to keep in mind that the world globally needs a lot of money to go into transition activities, including in India, from what I've seen, a total of 10 to 12 trillion in total. And this is arguable, these are estimates, needs to go into transition investments to get the economy to net zero. So despite all these normal challenges, there is a lot of momentum. There is frustration, but there's a lot of momentum around these issues, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jamal. I think it is a wonderful perspective. I think great international perspective to the audience, actually. And I think one very important point you made is that many Indian companies are operating internationally. So it is not as if that, if a CSRD regulation comes in Europe, you have to be alive to that and be ready for it, even though India may not want some of those disclosures, actually. That's a very important point. The second point you made is on green hushing. I was always amazed in this whole ESG era, where I have seen instances of my ESG report is better than yours, and people applying for awards, actually. I'm serious. I'm serious, actually. I think to a great extent, green hushing is probably not such a bad thing to do. You don't need to talk about what you're doing and let the action speak for itself, actually. So green hushing is a perfectly good strategy, while it may be working in a certain way in the US because of the woke, which happens. But I think doing more and talking less, and talking only through an annual sustainability report, which talks very tangibly, is very critical, actually. And I think what you talked about is the output metrics. The outcome metrics, very, very critical, actually. I think input metrics are not. Sometimes it may be required for regulators, like, for instance, anti-bribery. It may be very important in the anti-bribery context to demonstrate that you have trained the people, actually. Now, in terms of outcomes, have you achieved a different level of anti-bribery level after you train? You probably won't get data. And of course, if you're an SEC listed company, you have reporting obligations, actually. But definitely, I think outcome metrics are very important. Smart metrics are very, very critical, actually. Very, very critical. Mm-hmm. And the other point you made was an active ownership principles. And that is very critical. I saw when I was doing investor relations, if BlackRock had invested in my company, and you open the BlackRock annual report, they will actually tell you that they met us 3 times this year, actually, which means that for every company that they met, they actually disclose as to how many times they have met, actually. And also some of the principles around how they vote. In fact, we have had challenges, when during the pandemic, when the board, for instance, said that, notwithstanding the pandemic, because of the efforts of the management, we will give a certain bonus, if not small. I think we had investors saying no. We will not support that, to be honest, actually. I think so the active ownership principles engagement is definitely becoming important. You talked about ROI, and I think that's very critical. And I think that is where I think ROI is very, very critical. And, if you've seen examples of Danone where Faber, got fired, it's because the ROI of what he was trying to do was not good enough for investors, actually. And interoperability is also very critical. In fact, one question does come up is that if you're a US company, for instance, with a certain anti-bribery policy requirement or data privacy requirement, and you're operating in China, which may have a lower requirement, as an example, actually. Now, do you adopt a different standard? Are you going to be locally compliant, or are you going to be globally compliant? And I think that's a very, very important thing. In fact, I've seen in the context of some pharma companies, when they get 483s based on quality problems. In fact, I heard one person tell me, this was a few years ago, saying that, but these plants are produce medicines for Indian customers. They're not producing medicines for US customers, actually, which means he was openly saying that the quality standards are different. So interoperability means that one is in a very different, if I extend it, it also means that you need to have one standard, irrespective of whichever jurisdiction you operate, because you can't afford.
If I may elaborate on that, I have dealt with organizations that have that practical issue, and how do you deal with that? And the focus should be on who are your key stakeholders. If you have to report certain information to certain regulators that you have such and such policy, fine. But if we come back to the example, and this is an example that whether I'm talking to Canadians or Americans or Brits or people in Thailand or in India, this sort of example resonates with them. That let's take anti-bribery and corruption, for example. A lot of companies, if you look at their annual reports or sustainability reports, or sometimes they call it ESG report. And by the way, as we know, there are multiple reports. There's an annual report, and I've seen one that's 800 plus pages. I won't mention which global institution it is. And I've actually spoken with them. It's a major financial institution. And about 212 pages of that, it must be 212 if I know that number, is the auditor's report. And the rest is, the management and board, but a lot of ESG stuff in there. But then, by the way, they also have a sustainability report. And then you have others that also have an ESG Excel-based data set, okay, on top of that. But if I come back, so look, there's a lot of information to look at. And if people don't know, they don't have a lot of experience in what to really look for, even though they know how to use word search, it's still not enough. It's not just about word search. But let's take anti-bribery and corruption. Do you have such and such policy? Yes. Do you train your employees on that policy? Yes. Okay, some will go as far as saying, do you go down into your supply chain and require your suppliers to have that? Whether they're operating in Sweden, Germany, Canada, or in other parts of the world where maybe the laws exist, but there is more prevalence of anti-bribery and corruption, wherever that may be, so then they may not, I see a lot of companies that don't report that. However, the companies that do report that, including companies that are based in the UK and predominantly operating in European countries, still say we have identified our suppliers, which we believe may pose higher risk of anti-bribery and corruption. Because Europe, as we know, is certainly not immune to bribery and corruption. And we've identified those. Then we've got an outside third party going in and assessing their policies and how they implement, if there are any violations of anti-bribery and corruption in those supply chain category 1 suppliers. If we've identified any issues, we will report, or they do report, on any financial implications, whether they be big or small. Sometimes they say if it's under $1 million, they may not report it, or whatever the number may be. And then they'll also say, and we've implemented corrective action plans, CAPs, corrective action plans. And then the following year, they will say, of the corrective action plans for anti-bribery and corruption, could be human rights, let's say, could be another issue in their supply chain, could be around scope 3 emissions, okay? They've gone back to see how many of those corrective action plans have been fully implemented and resolved, remedied, okay? Now that is decision useful information. That's an actual outcome. Now, if you're a shareholder, investor, regulator, partner, and you're concerned about that, that's fine. And to the point that some of you have made about reputation, some companies will say, well, the accountants have told us that 2% of our revenue, whatever, materiality threshold is at a certain percentage of revenue and what have you. But how do you put a number on reputation risk? If it takes you years to build up reputation, and then one incident, even though it may be small, to tarnish it, how do you put a number on that? So a lot of companies in the ESG world that we live in, and who are thinking about what's fair and just, but also very pragmatic about risk management and value creation, and it has to be around risk management and value creation, all these issues, are looking at it that way. So I know I've given you a detailed explanation, but I think it's one that hopefully the audience benefits from.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your detailed explanation. I think we could go into the questions. Do we have any audience questions at this stage? Do we have any audience questions? I'm not able to see them on chat, actually.
There is nothing on chat, yeah.
There is?
No.
Okay. Then I think, should we, I mean, I think I just want to go back to Pradeep, actually. You heard Jamal and I speak, actually. I think, do you want to talk in terms of, and you talked a lot about regulators helping companies, actually. I think, how do you think that is working in the Indian context, actually? I think for instance, SEBI to some extent has been criticized for, reasonable assurance being too difficult for companies, where we could have begun with limited assurance and seen where the data goes, as an example, actually. And the reason I'm asking this question, Pradeep, is that it's a real live wire question for companies, because they've been scrambling to get this reasonable assurance done. And neither the auditors nor companies have kind of, they've struggled to get this done and reported last year. So would you like to respond on that, Pradeep?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting question, and that is something which is posed to the regulator every time we come out with a new concept.
Yeah.
So at one point in time, I remember it was board evaluation, and at some point in time it was disclosures during COVID. So those times we brought out an advisory on sort of handholding companies on what we deem to be an adequate disclosure. So and one other issue is also the fact that listing regulations around the world are largely contoured for all the listed entities, right?
Yeah.
Not contoured to a specific set of listed entities, so which will sort of also make the task a little more difficult. So it's important for the regulator to ensure that there is credibility in the market, but also not penalize companies who are trying to do it or may not be able to comply with that, and because of the reason that they are not able to understand what they have to do. So which is, if you look at it, SEBI, when it came to the BRR, for a period of 10 years until the BRSR came in, it was largely, though it was not a mandate in the sense like, it was a mandate for the first top 100 companies and then the top 1,000 companies, there was no action taken for non-disclosures, because we knew that at that point in time, SEBI knew that this was a time to handhold companies. This was something which is new, and people were grappling around as to what had to be disclosed, because there is no standard template around internationally also. And like Mr. Jamal very rightly said, there is always a very interesting prospect of you greenwashing your book itself. Your book can look very attractive as to what all you have done, but which may not be there in real sense. And that is where probably the concept of the reputation risk, which I was talking about, came in. But then after the BRSR was brought in, if you look at it, the compliance is staggered, right? Initially, when it was brought, it was said, okay, we'll do it for the top 100 companies. With those learnings, we push to the top 500 companies. Then with that, now it has become 1,000 companies. And if you look at it, the BRSR is an improvement over the BRR. I also want to go back to the committee in which I was a member, and we had made two sort of recommendations. We had made two recommendations there. One was where we had said, okay, there will be a BRSR. The second one, what we did was we said that there is a BRSR light. Now, what is a BRSR light? And that is how the regulator tries to handhold, right? And what is a BRSR light? A BRSR light is something where we want smaller companies, an MSME, to also follow a BRSR, right? Yeah. So that was also brought out. So these are the various things how a regulator can sort of handhold companies to sort of comply with these disclosures, which are sometimes, because many of these things could also be just mired in jargon, right? You can always just write something very flavored. It can be inchoate and all that, but that is something what we are trying to do. And that is where Mr. Jamal's point on also marrying quantitative and qualitative metrics, becomes important. When you marry quantitative metrics, then you are able to compare as to what you did last year and where are you this year, right? When it comes to, for example, complaints about sexual harassment, right? Complaints under the POCSO Act. So what have you ddone this time? So are there allegations of child labor? So what have you done this time? Have you taken corrective action? So that is where BRSR sort of takes care of these important issues for companies.
Great. In fact, I've just been told that Mr. Sundaresan is still on the call. I have one question for Mr. Sundaresan, if you're around. I think one of the challenges.
Is he on the call?
Yes, I believe so.
No, I don't see him there.
He's not there?
No. But okay. I think there are questions which have been posted by people.
Yeah, I know, because I just when I heard Sundaresan was on the call, I thought I could ask him. But let's go to the questions which are coming in. I think one of the questions which is coming in is that are boards sincerely considering the ESG metrics impacting executive compensation? I think I agree. In fact, I think increasingly Indian companies are kind of disclosing that management compensation has a certain percentage allocated to ESG metrics. And that is good. And that is something which is gradually coming in. I think it is taking time, but it will come in for sure.
And it's anyway a mandate. The disclosures on executive compensation are anyway a mandate. So
the
compliance officer, it is there in the annual report. Yeah.
Can
Exactly.
I just, may I briefly comment on that. There are certain that I strongly encourage boards to make those ESG metrics meaningful, not just a tick box exercise in itself. And yes, greenhouse gas emissions, should be there for sure, and however you customize that. But if it's going to be around DEI issues, in certain parts of the world, there's a requirement to have more, let's say, female representation on boards, ethnic minority representation on boards. I'm for that. In this part of the world, I am an ethnic minority, and I certainly support that. And I've actually, on boards I've sat on, I've championed the inclusion of having more women on boards, and literally championed that. However, is that a useful outcome? The so what question still exists. How did you leverage those skills if you're going to do that? And I raise that as an example because I often see that as a KPI compensation, a KPI linked to senior management compensation. Female representation on boards, female representation on senior management teams. The important thing is don't just put them there. Use them effectively and then provide narrative as to how they benefited, how that benefited the organization. That's one thing. The other point around that is if there's a wide gap in gender pay gap, and I see this in different countries, the pay gap issue in Europe, is monitored. Companies have to report it. In other parts of the world, it's not monitored, but it may get implemented over time, and regulators and others may say, hey, larger companies, you need to report your gender pay gap. If the gender pay gap is wide, why would that not be a more meaningful outcome measure linked to compensation for senior managers, that they're going to reduce that gender pay gap? Because one can argue that if that is a serious issue in some companies, if you reduce that gender pay gap, your turnover is going to be lower. Your employee turnover is going to be lower. Your productivity is going to be higher. Your employee satisfaction is going to be higher. Your reputation will improve. There has to be obviously a cost consideration there. But these are the kind of things that one needs to think about rather than just ticking some boxes when it comes to ESG linked compensation.
Correct. No, I agree with that, Jamal, actually. I'll just go to the next question, which is how are ESG regulatory frameworks influencing corporate behavior, particularly in sectors that are less traditionally aligned with ESG principles? I'm not sure what is meant by less traditionally aligned. I think maybe hard to abate could be an example. Hard to abate is probably an example.
It should be hard to abate.
Yeah, I think every sector has an obligation, and I think, but there are challenges. Hard to abate is a very big challenge. Like in South Africa, as an example, the power comes from coal, and there has been a big movement to sort of say that can we shift out of coal? And fundamentally, the question is livelihoods. The coal miners are saying, you can shift to green power, but what happens to all of us who have been working? Now, it's great to see what UK has done recently. It has exited coal power completely, actually. So maybe there is some learning in terms of how the workers' considerations, earning livelihood, training considerations were kind of taken care of, actually. The next question, which I can see is that—
They are, by the way, they have been provided, just on that, they have been provided an option for training when they come out of coal and other brown, dirty fuel industries to get trained to provide services and be employed in the renewable energy sector. That's being done.
Great. And I think one of the questions which is there is, what is the liability of the board for anything going wrong in ESG? Would you like to take it on, Mr. Jamal? Liability of the board in case anything going wrong in ESG. That's the question.
Yeah, that's it falls under the certain regulations for one thing, right? It will fall under certain regulations. So if you've got an anti-greenwashing claims code, who's going to get penalized for that? Is it just going to be the CEO, or is it also going to be the board? And then the shareholders will hold you accountable. At the very least, you'll be voted out at the very least. So when there are regulations out there and around greenwashing and other things, that's a starting point. And the shareholder activism is another important area where they do get held accountable.
That's right. In fact, I think climate litigation is now growing. And one of the big things which is now emerging in climate litigation is stranded assets. I think there was one very important case of a Polish company which was establishing a coal mine and in Europe, actually, and in Poland. And Client Earth sued the company and the directors, saying that you're going to get into stranded assets because in a few years' time, you will not be able to operate the coal mine, actually. And so climate litigation is certainly going up. And in this area, there are new principles being established, like Netherlands is at the forefront of it. Recently, some age-old pensioners in Switzerland have sued the government for not doing adequately in terms of protecting. So I think this whole responsibility thing, the whole litigation around climate is kind of going up quite significantly, actually. Very interesting question. And I think maybe Pradeep, you can respond to it, which is MSME sector companies monitoring for ESG compliance. How is the regulator thinking about it?
So presently, we have a disclosure requirement in case you have more than 15 million as far as net worth is concerned. In case you are a fund, we have said that in case it's assets under management are more than 3 million US dollars. So in which case then you will have to make disclosures. Now, as far as MSME is concerned, because the traditional definition of MSME, I don't know where it will fall, but because 75 crore is what is the new limit as far as India is concerned. And we have said that if it is $25 million, that is when you can sort of list your equity shares. So that is the thing that we have mentioned. But as far as bonds are concerned, because now a MSME company can always take a bond. So that is something which can happen. Now, as far as ESG compliances are concerned, we are having a green reporting framework on a quarterly basis. We have asked the stock exchanges to do a slice and dice of the reporting. And on that basis, we are sort of taking into account as to what action can be taken in case companies are not complying. So that's a very fluid and a difficult task to do because then it requires also compliance and also reliance on certain external certification as to whether there has been a spending on the actual green projects for which the money was taken in the first place. But we are on it. So we are a new regulator, but we are on it. But it is happening. But I'll again like to go back to one thing which I mentioned earlier, and this is very much palpable when it comes to companies. When you do something that is not acceptable as an ESG practice, the market, whether it is a customer, a stakeholder, whether it's a customer or a shareholder, or even a bondholder, they take action against the company, right? By either leaving the company alone, you cold shoulder the company, which again makes you come back to the market, or else you sort of dump the stock, which also has an impact on the share price.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, thank you. I think very valid. Though, of course, exclusionary investing, which says that I will not invest in coal and oil, has not worked. The oil companies can get whatever monies they want even today, to be honest, actually.
Yeah, see, today the same big ticket investors who are preaching about ESG are investing in F1 races.
Of
right?
course.
So then there seems to be something which is very dichotomous, like a little diabolical when it comes to that. So that is something which we are also sort of monitoring. Yeah.
Just on that point, there are those investors who don't care and they'll just say, we're going to make money off of oil and gas and whether or not they have a transition plan. And then there are others and a growing number of investors saying, we know that the world needs oil. We know that the world needs coal. And if you look at the IE data, it's declining. The use of, fossil fuels is declining. So other investors are saying, we're not going to back away from that because we don't want to shut off the lights around the world. And we have a fiduciary duty to our pension holders or life insurance holders or whoever they might be representing. But we want to see your transition plan. And we want to see how you're making progress on that transition plan to transition away from this. So you're getting both. And I think we're going to see more and more of that over time.
Correct. The next question is actually very interesting. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Is also that we also have to consider that all countries are not even when it comes to population, when it comes to rate of industrial growth and type of industrial growth. So it becomes difficult to have a one-size-fits-all policy for all companies. So each country needs to sort of approach this in its own way. But like Mr. Jamal very rightly put it, when you are not there today where you were yesterday, that is itself is an improvement.
Yeah. The next question is very interesting in terms of how do you redesign human consumption habits? How do you get into active consumer education? I think that's a great point. I will only talk about one example. I think the clothing industry is one of the worst polluters, actually. In fact, the fast fashion industry in particular, actually. And recently, France introduced a €5 tax on fast fashion sales, actually, which is very valid. And I think ultimately there is no option, as somebody said, that the world has everything for need, but doesn't have everything for greed, actually. I think ultimately simplicity is something which is very, very important, actually. And this is an evolving thing. I think what I would say is that the younger generation is probably more conscious of it in terms of simplicity. In fact, I think they are better in terms that they will have to kind of, pay for the excesses that the earlier generation kind of committed, to be honest, actually. So I think consumer education, changing consumption habits, more simplicity and sustainable way of living is something very critical. In fact, for, I think, Sid, who asked this question, there are even, if you go to the internet and search for personal sustainability scores, you can actually measure yourself. It'll ask you, do you take a bus? When you go to do shopping, do you take a plastic? Do you take a cloth bag? I think there are some of those metrics which come. I think this is a very important question, and I think that has to be tackled in very different ways, actually. I think Professor Colin, I think he has a question. Many frameworks seem focused on stopping damaging activities. What should be done to encourage the creation of sustainable activities? I think that's a fair question, actually. I think IRA, for instance, is probably an example where significant investment is going in to encourage environmentally friendly areas, actually. So that's one big action which is happening for sure. And carbon, I think carbon, CBAM, carbon taxes, some of those are also helping, actually, because I think companies are definitely pivoting their models to kind of make sure that they go green. Like steel companies are moving from coal-based furnaces to gas-based furnaces to eventually green hydrogen at some stage, actually. Yeah. But I think
just on that, Gary, I'm mindful of time. The green taxonomies provide guidance on what is a sustainable activity, and then investors will say, if let's say you're a fund and you're trying to raise money, and you're saying you want to invest in these things, or you're not going to invest in certain things. The LP, the asset owner, often looks at that more and more closely, in Europe in particular, and says, I can't give you money because you're investing in things that don't fall within the green taxonomy, and we need to invest in that, okay? And other companies, operating businesses, are also being affected by that, because when they go to raise money, for their expansion, the capital expenditures, they're being questioned on that by banks and by others. So I think taxonomies and things of that nature do help. And then, to the point about consumer activism, if you look at, one of the slides I had, or the consumer behavior, I should say, the Green Claims Code here in the UK, the regulator has gone to 17 fashion companies and textile producers and said, hey, you're being cautioned. And three more, so 20 in total, have had to sign agreements of how they're going to actually change their behaviors. But it's a combination of things. It's regulations, it's disclosure, and it boils down to individual values also.
Yeah,
personal values.
I think there's a very important question, Pradeep, probably for you. I think how does reduced returns in the initial time period be adjusted in the financials? I think blended finance comes in a big way here, actually. I think you're best placed to respond. I can respond, but I think you're better placed, actually.
No, I think you should respond. I want to hear you respond, because
okay, fine.
You a regulatory perspective.
Okay, fine. No, I think blended finance is a very big role to play. I think if you look at for instance, one of the initiatives that we did was the problem with new technologies which help in sustainability is that many of them are untested. So when I was at Indian Hotels, we did a series of pilots with IFC Washington. So IFC Washington has this program where they, through a search, identify people who have interesting technologies, and they actually pay for implementation, which means when we did the 9 pilots, we had zero cost, actually, which means that if those pilots failed, we had zero cost. And if those pilots succeeded, IFC worked with us in terms of saying what can be expanded. So I think philanthropy is becoming a very important part of kind of helping with the initial stages where returns may be non-existent. And then you get on to if you look at investing styles, you have finance first investments, which are the conventional investors. Then you have finance first, but impact led, which is, finance first, but I'll also look at impact. Then you have impact first funds, which look at impact substantially, which means they're willing to take a hit. And then you have philanthropy. So I think blended finance is about making sure that you kind of address and take advantage of different financing at different stages, which means construction period. It's like the old construction period financing in project finance, where a high risk investor would come in, and then a takeout financier would come in at the end of the construction period, where you could get, I think there'll be people with different appetites, to be honest, actually. And I think that's the only way to sort of take care of it. Pradeep, any responses on that?
So no, nothing more than except the fact that we have not exactly wrapped our heads completely on blended finance. So there have been a couple of cases where international visits that we have undertaken, where we have seen as to what a few other international practices are, though there are no specific regulations surrounding this. So since this will cast a regulatory aspersion on what I will say, I'll just want to stop by saying that, but we are trying to bring something on this, but at a very early stage.
No, I think, no, thank you. We are, in fact, I think this discussion has been excellent.
Sorry, Gary, I've been working on blended finance for over 20 years, but I think you've covered it, and I've sat on boards of impact investors. I think the important thing right now is that it has to, if we're going to solve society's big problems, it has to make commercial sense. And what I'm hearing,
right? That does not make economic sense.
Exactly. And there are certain market failures where a lower rate of return may be needed with guarantees from the government and others to protect investors, because there's market failures or there isn't capital for that. But I'm increasingly, I should say, hearing from people in finance and financial institutions and others, things like someday all finance will be sustainable finance. And that's one of the reasons why. And that's one of the reasons why the greenium is shrinking. There's other reasons too, but that's one of the reasons why greenium is shrinking, because they're basically saying, some parts of the market, we expect you to do this. We're not expecting a lower return now. You need to do this.
Yes, exactly. You're right.
Thank you. I think we will end this.
In fact, it's more like, no, I will not incentive your progress to green. You're supposed to do that.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I think IOD had a couple of questions, poll questions. In fact, it's my mistake. I should have run those poll questions before this panel started. But perhaps, Sana, can you just show the poll questions for the audience, please?
Is it visible?
I think audience, exactly. Great to see this.
To be answered by them.
Wow. Very good. Oh, nice. Nice. I think this is expected, isn't it? I think there are very few people not familiar. Most people are familiar, and some people, of course, are much more familiar. I think
55%
I think this I think is on expected lines. Should we go to the second question?
Should we show the result first?
Sir, we are closing the voting polling responses, and we'll immediately show the results also.
Okay, fine.
Result is in front of you.
I think now you can see the result being displayed.
Yeah. Very good.
And we have one question.
Yeah.
Now I request to show the next question, which is a final question.
The next question, yeah.
Launched.
We request the audience to accordingly poll.
Yeah.
No prizes for guessing the answer to
that.
So it's more of a mandate which is pushed down my throat.
Correct. In a way, I think the answer is probably all the above at one level, actually.
Yes. Yes.
Great.
But it's interesting to see that pressure from investor and stakeholders is currently showing low.
Low. Yeah.
And I'm not that surprised, because if in the Indian context, it's still emerging, right? These issues are still emerging.
Yeah. In fact, this is a common problem which I faced, because sometimes consultants would come and tell me, investors want this, so do it, Giri. Then I would say, but I deal with investors. Nobody is asking me these questions that you're asking me to do. And therefore, I think, don't tell me investors are asking. I think I know what investors want from me, actually. So the pressure from investors, I agree with you, that is kind of not as serious in India at this point of time. Yeah. But certain industries could be facing the pressure for sure.
I think that will change in the coming 12 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that will change.
Good. I think, should we close the poll, Sana?
Right.
Fine. Thank you so much. I think thank you for Pradeep and Jamal for this session, and thank you, audience, for your questions. I personally enjoyed it. I know we have delayed it significantly, and over to you for the next special talk, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjeevi, for facilitating this Q&A session. And thank you to all of our speakers for taking the time out to share your insights. I think we need a part 2 for this session, even based on what those polls revealed. So thank you so much. I'd like to now invite Mr. Pradeep Chaturvedi, Vice President, Institute of Directors, to propose our vote of thanks. Mr. Chaturvedi, are you here?
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I'm here. Ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the close of this enriching webinar, I'm honored to extend a heartfelt vote of thanks to Professor Colin Coulson-Thomas for opening address, to Mr. V.S. Sundaresan for his insightful guest of honor address, Mr. Pradeep Ramakrishnan for his engaging keynote address, and also our thanks to our esteemed panelists, Mr. Pyarali, Jamal, for sparing valuable time and sharing the insights, and of course, Mr. Giridhar, Sanjeevi, for chairing the panel discussion so skillfully. I would also like to extend our sincere thanks to all the participants. Your commitment to staying informed and being part of such invigorating conversations is commendable. Our gratitude extends to the partners of the Boardroom webinar series, NASDAQ, BitScore, Cybertech LLP, Board PAC, Gujarat Fluorochemicals Limited, Alex Consulting, and Texman. Before we conclude, I have the great pleasure in inviting Dr. Jennifer Jukanovich, who had so wonderfully co-hosted today's session. Dr. Jukanovich is the managing partner at Ambecat's Global Solutions and a faculty coach with the M.J. Murdoch Charitable Trust. A former college vice president and non-profit director, she continues to advise social impact ventures both in the US and internationally. She is also the co-author of the book, The Culturally Conscious Board. Today, she will be sharing her insights on the theme, the imperative role of S in ESG, driving a culturally conscious board for sustainable growth. Now we request Dr. Jennifer Jukanovich to kindly speak. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I know we are over time, and so I want to be very brief in just the next hopefully 3 to 5 minutes. But so much has been discussed, and we all know that boards are on the hot seat. And while my work has been much more in the nonprofit social transformation sector, I am seeing this just as has been alluded today, in terms of the pressures on boards to do what is right, really, and to make the decisions that are imperative for us to sustain our globe and our lives together. And so part of what, you've talked a lot and speakers have highlighted that there's the E and the G get a lot of attention and not always the S. And so we may need just a whole other session or webinar on the S in particular. But the S has to do, and even Mr. Jamal was highlighting this, and that even NASDAQ has a diversity rule, and more pressure is being placed upon boards to do what is right ultimately. But how do you do that, and why do you do that, and how do you pay attention to the internal dynamics both in your corporation but also on your board? And so as something that was revealed in the National Association of Corporate Directors did a blue ribbon commission where they call on boards to explicitly use culture as an instrument to drive board excellence in today's complex environment. And this is all just really a background for me in terms of why I serve on boards, that it's not actually about me. It's not just about the bottom line. It's about the people that your companies and your organizations are serving. And so for me in particular, some of the boards that I have served on, it's been about that first generation college student or a social impact business that we started in Rwanda where we're bringing seeds to market. Various reasons why we all do what we do and the businesses that we are about. And it's what we have found is that if you have an unhealthy board culture, that is going to impact your stakeholders. It's going to impact the people you are serving. And so my colleague Russell West and I, in the work that we've been doing, started training boards around really understanding their culture and before they could even welcome new voices to the table. As Mr. Jamal just said, like, we don't want the S to become just another list of things that you're, a tick box, things that you're just checking off to say, oh, we did this. We actually want to really highlight this boardroom table that you are coming around and saying, how do we make decisions? Are we operating at full capacity? Because we actually have a healthy board culture. Even last week, I was talking with a friend who is involved in several environmental companies, new technologies, and he was asking me about my book, and he knows that I'm really in the nonprofit sector, but he said, Jen, I feel like this book has to do with the for-profit sector as well. He said, I'm working on a $250 million deal right now, and we have investors coming to the table, and we are seeing that our way of being around that table has not been healthy, and it's impacting the mission, it's impacting our stakeholders, and the deal is at stake because of that. And ultimately, the deal is involving technology that will help sustain the environment. And so we had a really rich conversation because what we define a culturally conscious board is that it's one that's taking into account all of its stakeholders and the society around which it serves, and it's taking it's understanding culture as part of its decision making, and it's taking time to understand where it might have blindfolds. Alluded to before, when you're working in different cultural contexts, and what is good in India may be different than what is good in Belgium, and so how do you determine which goals to pursue? And so what blindfolds do you have when you're coming into those conversations? Ultimately, you're making decisions on behalf of other people, and you're deciding with those stakeholders and who is at the table, whose voices are being heard in those decisions. And so these are questions that we've been asking, and so much of this conversation has been around very, very specific goals that, we're setting and seeking to attain. And there's also the greenwashing that's been happening, or the green hushing. That was a new phrase I learned today. And so actually our book has been around what is the posture by which you're coming to that boardroom table. And this has to do with a posture of humility where you recognize that your company is part of something greater than yourself. You're achieving these goals on behalf of the planet, really. But you also know who you are as a company, and you know that your perception is limited by what you do not know. And as your humility increases, also your trust with one another around that boardroom table is going to increase. And so we talk about making your culture become an asset and not a liability to the decision-making that you have to do. And that involves making mentionable what's kind of off the table and putting it on the table. And so we do this because we believe that deeper conversations are going to have deeper impact. And that as you have greater trust, I mean, so much of what's been talked about today has to do with credibility, transparency, accountability. And that is really requires deep trust around a board. And these are some of the things that you can't put metrics to necessarily, except that it reveals itself through the metrics, through the accountability and the transparency that you have, and you're creating deeper trust in your boardroom culture. And so we created a tool. It really, I work with organizations as a coach, and we love to ask good questions. And so we are trying to say, who are you as an organization? And then what are the intentions you have? So many intentions, as we've seen with ESG goals. And then how do you invite the right people to the table? What are your investments you're putting behind that? And what is the impact that you long to have? And so we walk people through this, we call the board culture placemat, around our metaphor of the boardroom table. And we have laid this out in a story. It's actually, we invite people into a story of meeting a new board member and her experience at the table and the different personalities that she interacts with. We've been very fortunate to have Arthur Brooks from Harvard endorse our book, and we invite you, this is the Amazon India, to take a look at it and see if you can find yourself in the story, and how might this also impact the social goals that you have as part of this ESG. So there's so much more I know we could share, but as you are working to attack both the E and the G, I hope that you will also take into account your own board culture and how you make decisions, and having a healthy board culture as part of that conversation. So thank you for including me today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your wonderful presentation. Now, I encourage all participants to stay connected and continue the conversations started here today. Together, let us all contribute to pioneering a silent revolution within the boardroom. Further, the third webinar from this series will be on the theme AI momentum and cybersecurity. I hope you all will join us. Till then, stay green, stay informed, and continue to lead with integrity. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.